In 1925, a small Tennessee courtroom became the battleground between legendary lawyer Clarence Darrow and renowned orator William Jennings Bryan. The issue being debated in the famous Scopes monkey trial was the right to teach Darwin's theory of evolution as opposed to divine creation in public schools. 70 years later, in the courts, state legislatures, and local school boards across the nation, this emotionally charged debate continues.
Lawyers seek to discover new ways to resolve legal issues on Inside the Law. Inside the Law is made possible in part by a grant from Reliance National Insurance Company, providing property, casualty, accident, and health insurance. Reliance National, the choice.
Today's program, The Law and Religion, Creationism versus Evolution. Hello, I'm Jack Ford. 114 years after the death of Charles Darwin and 9 years after the Supreme Court struck down state laws requiring equal time for the teaching of evolution and creation in public schools, the struggle between creationism and evolution continues. There are even differences of opinion within the scientific and religious communities themselves. Should divine creation be included in a public school curriculum, or does this violate the separation of church and state contemplated by the First Amendment? Is the debate over evolution a constitutional issue or a scientific issue? Joining us today to discuss these issues are Dr. Charles Haynes of the Freedom Forum First Amendment Center of Vanderbilt University, Dr. Kevin Padian, professor of biology and paleontology and president of the National Center for Science Education, Attorney Michael McElrath, who provides pro bono legal services to advocates of evolution, Dr. William Dembski, visiting scholar at Notre Dame who has doctorate degrees in both mathematics and philosophy, and by satellite from Atlanta, Wendell Bird, an Atlanta attorney who argued the landmark case on evolution versus creationism before the United States Supreme Court. As we know, the legal debate over these issues began back in 1925 with the Scopes trial. Mr. Bird, let me come to you first and ask you to explain to us what's happened in the courts since that time and what is the status of these issues right now?
There's been a total reversal in position. In the 1920s, many states excluded the teaching of evolution while teaching creation. That was unfair. Today, all states exclude the teaching of any alternative to evolution and indoctrinate students in just one view, the view of evolution.
Dr. Haynes, why then, if these issues in a legal sense seem to be settled, why are we all still arguing about this now?
Well, unfortunately, this has become a political issue and an educational issue, and we don't have much clarity on it. Lots of teachers are confused. They don't have good guidelines. Where, for example, do critics of the prevailing view in science get a voice in the curriculum? Teachers aren't sure. Also, many Americans feel that public education is hostile to their faith. Many Americans still hold views that are contrary to what the prevailing views are in the science community. So for these reasons, these issues simply don't go away no matter what the courts say.
Mr. Bird, it was nearly a decade ago that you argued what has been described as a landmark case in this area before the U.S. Supreme Court. Tell us briefly what that case was about and what the court's conclusion was.
The case involved the Louisiana Act for Balanced Treatment of Creation Science and Evolution Science. There, the state of Louisiana said if you teach one scientific view, you must teach the other scientific view. The U.S. Supreme Court struck that down, saying that there was a religious purpose behind the Louisiana law, though they didn't directly criticize the teaching of scientific evidence that might be consistent with creation. The U.S. Supreme Court did say very significantly that public school teachers may teach a variety of theories besides evolution on the subject of origins, as long as they're scientific.
Dr. Dembski, to give us a sense of context here, let me ask you to briefly describe for us the theory of creation science and how it contradicts the theory of evolution.
Okay, I think first thing one has to do is make a distinction between creationism narrowly construed and broadly construed. Narrowly construed creationism, and this is how it's usually presented to the public, is a 6-day creation account following a literal Genesis narrative. Broadly construed, it's the view that God created the world for a purpose, and that the living forms that we see derive their order, complexity from an intelligent agent. presumably God. So the thing is, that second broader notion is not tied to a Genesis account, is not tied to seeing Genesis as a scientific text. And that's really where the tension is. Is there an intelligent cause behind the organized complexity that we see in living systems? And is that cause detectable in some scientific way? That's what the creationist, broadly construed, wants to say. And the evolutionist wants to say, no, it's just brute material processes spontaneously organizing themselves.
Dr. Padian, is that a good synopsis, if you will, of what we're talking about here?
I would say it's about a 60%, but maybe really quite different. There's an important distinction, which is that in science, we actually don't make comments about whether there are supreme designers or gods or any kind of supernatural forces at all, because we work on the basis of what the secondary laws of the universe are, not whether or not there's a prime mover. It's interesting that almost every faith across all nations, religious creeds, and cultures has no problem working within the scientific framework, the paradigm in which evolution works. So I think it's perfectly appropriate to recognize that there are certainly people who don't accept this because of the way that they read their religious documents. I think we have to have tremendous respect for that.
Just a quick thing. Right here, I think you conflated a religious doctrine with a scientific point of view. Supernatural action is not the same thing as detecting intelligent causation. We do this all the time in science. Archaeologists detect intelligent causes when they find artifacts. NASA SETI program, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, there's the presumption that we can detect intelligent causes from outer space. Insofar as we're doing science in creationism, we're trying to detect an intelligent cause. It's
is
simply
this a natural or a supernatural intelligent cause?
That is to be decided.
Mr. McElrath, we talked before about the somewhat settled state of the law here, yet we seem to be hearing a great deal very recently on the local level, legislators, town councils, and school boards. That seems to be suggesting that maybe this isn't so settled.
Yeah, I think your original question, why are we still debating this issue, is it goes to precisely that reason. The reason is that the legal issues, I think, have all been decided. Mr. Byrd argued a case back in 1986, the Edwards v. Aguillard case. Before that case was a decision in 1982, the McLean case, in which a federal district court systematically went through, and all of the arguments you'll hear today about why this is science, it's not religion, the court effectively went through them and dismissed them all as being really religious doctrine. So I think the legal arguments have been fought in the courts, and the courts have said you can't teach it in the schools. The reason that we're here today is that we're not looking at so much as a legal battle as a political battle. As Dr. Haynes said, that this is a political issue for many people who feel that their religion is threatened. And as a result, they're now electing school board members. They're pressuring teachers. They're pressuring principals of schools not to teach evolution or to get what the Edwards decision said you couldn't do, get creationism taught in the public schools.
Mr. Byrd, you wanted in on this?
Yes, first in response to that last comment, while courts have addressed the question of whether creation science can be taught, the U.S. Supreme Court has, I think, correctly addressed whether alternative scientific theories besides evolution can be taught, and has said clearly they can be. The problem is that public schools almost everywhere fail to teach anything except evolution. Therefore, they're indoctrinating students in evolution and not teaching alternatives. My own view is that all of the scientific evidence ought to be taught on the subject so that students aren't indoctrinated on one side and censored on the other. In response to something Dr. Padian said, he has said that scientists do not make conclusions about whether there is or is not a God and so forth. Unfortunately, he's not describing a very large percentage of the scientists. Sir Julian Huxley had no problem saying that there is no God, science disproves it. Many such as Theodore Roszak write, when I learned my Darwinism, I learned it as a religious catechism in the sense that no alternative theory of the evidence was ever introduced. That's true in public schools almost everywhere.
Let's talk. Go ahead,
well, Jack, what would be wrong, and I'd be interested to know what our scientists would say, what would be wrong if a public school science teacher was able to say, you know, this is the prevailing view, most scientists believe this, but there are other views. There are critiques of the prevailing view that claim to be science. Let's look at those. What's wrong with some of the voices being heard in the science curriculum, much less the social studies?
Could I do that right now? If I'm a biology teacher in a high school and I'm not 100% certain that Darwin was right, could I stand up right now, general state of law, Mr. McElrath, in my classroom and say, well, here's what Darwin said. But you know what? I got some problems with all of that. And let me give you another thought here that I happen to subscribe to and get into intelligent design or creation theory. Can I do that right now?
You could not do that right now. That would be viewed as religious indoctrination. You'd be teaching a religious doctrine. I think that Mr. Padian would tell you that this idea of intelligent design is just another name for what we used to hear of as creationism, and the courts have said you can't teach that.
This is what I would challenge, that this is not repackaged creationism a la what we saw in 1983 or 81 with the Arkansas.
You're talking about the concept of intelligent design?
That's what I would say.
Dr. Padian, explain to us, that for people that are just watching this the first time and just starting to wrestle or grapple with this, what is the difference between intelligent design and what we've referred to as the creation theory?
I would say that there really is a difference. I think there is. I would support Dr. Dembski on this. I think that strict creationism that comes out of some kind of religious or biblical story, such as our Genesis story or the Genesis story of any culture, that certainly is coming from a religious background. But I think the intelligent design theory is something that is actually not new, and we've seen it with William Paley and people in the early 1800s and late 1700s. It comes from a different cloth perhaps, but it really is very much the same intellectual tradition. I mean, I don't really have a problem with the idea of intelligent design. I have a question with it about how we test this scientifically. One thing that I think really needs to be clarified, what Mr. Bird said I think is opposite to this, is that when you do science, it doesn't matter what many scientists believe or some scientists believe. What it comes down to is whether you can publish peer-reviewed results that go into the scientific community and are evaluated by the other people in the field, and they think it holds water or it doesn't. People make their golden fortunes by overturning received ideas in science every day. If you pick up any science magazine, any science section of the paper, that's what it's all about. And people certainly have a perfect right to go after evolution, thermodynamics, relativity, continental drift, or anything they want to. But they've got to do it according to the scientific standards of the field. And so far, this hasn't been met.
You know, if we really want science teachers to take seriously the critiques of what is prevailing in the scientific community, we have to help them to understand what some of these arguments are. They don't. Right. Now, we leave it all out because that's the easiest course. And Jack, your question to us a minute ago should have been reframed, I think, and we could answer it better. If the teacher had said, now, there are some people who believe, or these people believe, or according to this religious group, or according to this group of scientists, teachers can teach about the various views, religious or otherwise, and I would say even in a science classroom. But so we shouldn't close the science classroom down because of this debate, and that's what's happened here.
So if it comes from me as the teacher, not in the context of me saying, these are the problems I have with Darwin, or this is what I believe, rather if I say, there's another school of thought out there.
The teacher should be careful not to take sides on a religious issue particularly, and in this context, even if there are claims that people are making this is science against what the scientific community is by and large saying, the teacher has to be careful to bring those in a way that's fair and objective. But I think that we have to open up the discussion. Otherwise, we're teaching scientism if we don't allow critiques to be heard somewhere in the discussion.
Mr. McElrath?
Yeah, I think that this is, you know, it appears to be an appeal to fairness, you know, and this is an appeal that's been made also to get creationism into the classroom. That is, if we have science or evolution in the classroom, why can't we offer competing theories? Why can't we have one viewpoint presented that opposes the current viewpoint? And I think it really, I think it does two things. Number one, it misstates the issue. The issue is whether or not science should be taught in the classroom. And I think that the competing theories, Mr. Padian will tell you, or purported competing theories, really are not science, and they shouldn't be allowed in the science classroom. It's fine teaching about these theories in other classrooms, but not in the science classroom. That's one point. But I think another point that's worth making is that it really debases religion to say that there are these other theories out there. I mean, do you really want public school teachers to say, this is a theory, that the Genesis account is a theory? I mean, these are serious religious beliefs for a lot of people, and that's why the state really shouldn't be involved in saying one way or the other. You know, this idea that there should be a balance, I mean, I think the balance has already been struck. Public school science teachers, let me just finish it. Public school science teachers should not go into the classroom either. They shouldn't say, science proves that there is no God. I mean, I think we've already made that concession.
One of the problems I seek out of all this is if I'm putting myself back in the role of the teacher that I made myself a few moments ago, I'm getting real nervous about any of this.
And
all of a sudden
unfair.
I'm starting to pull back saying, why am I being stuck in the middle of this?
Well, it's very unfair to teachers. They're not prepared to deal with these subtleties, so they end up dealing with kind of a Carl Sagan, excuse me for using him, as as an example, but a Carl Sagan version that the universe was all there ever was, all there is, and all there ever will be. They allow that kind of thing in a science classroom, but they don't allow anything else in because we're so afraid that the people that, you know, are going to get in the door that have another view. Well, what about the history of science? What about the philosophy of science? Science teachers need a better grounding in how to let the debate be heard. And there shouldn't be sort of a saying, this science classroom is only going to deal with science, when a lot of teachers don't know what you mean by that. Well, even science teachers don't know what you mean by that.
This label of religion and science, I mean, these labels can be tossed around in very facile fashion. Yeah. And this is what I think you have done, Mr. McElrath. I mean, it's right at the start of this program, I made a distinction between creation broadly construed and even talked about intelligent design. When the NASA SETI program, when they set their observatory up and bring in all these channels, they are looking for signs of intelligence. That's a scientific program, I would say. And when we look for signs of intelligence in living organisms, that can be a scientific program also. Now, it's an incipient program. It's fledgling. It's getting going. But it is a scientific program. It is not religion. I'm not getting any apologetic mileage out of it. I'm not trying to say that this designer or intelligence is the Trinitarian God of Christianity.
Mr. Bird, let me ask you this question. I'm a parent, and I am not comfortable, because of my own religious beliefs, with my child being taught evolution in science class. Can I right now, if I'm in a public school, my child is in a public school, can I say, walk in and say, I'm pulling my child out of class while this subject is being taught? Can I do that?
In most public schools, you can't. And it's unfair for the student and the parent to have to be in that position when there's a whole range of scientific evidence that's being censored, not presented to the child, because it's not consistent with the evolutionary dogma that is the official view to be taught in most public school classrooms. The easy solution is simply to present all the evidence fairly, scientific evidence only.
Actually, Jack, now in public schools, you can be excused if the request is a limited one that can be reasonably accommodated without destroying the curriculum. You can be excused from limited portions of a curriculum, and I think public schools should routinely do that. I think, in fact, kids and parents have a right to have a limited excusal. Also, right now, science teachers can say there are other views. They may not know what to say about them, or they may have to say they're taught about elsewhere, but they can at least alert kids to the fact that we're not saying here that we're trying to attack your religion or undermine it. They also can do in public schools something right now, and that is they can teach various worldviews in the social studies, for example. Even while we wrestle with this question in science, the reason that's, in many states say that's what we do, we teach it in the social studies. But then they don't go on to even prepare the social studies teachers to handle this discussion.
How about if the issue comes from a student? How about if in this same classroom we're talking about, I'm going along teaching what I'm told I should teach, and all of a sudden one of my students says to me, well, Mr. Ford, I've got a question here. I want to talk about the concept of divine creation, and it's something I happen to believe very deeply in. Let's talk about that here. Can I do that if I'm the teacher?
If you were the teacher, I would advise you not to get into that with a student. I think that it's a dangerous issue. You're dealing with a student's religious beliefs, and you want to be respectful of those religious beliefs. At the same time, you're a science teacher, and your mission is to teach the students science. I think the best thing to do is to say, what we're teaching here is science. This is accepted science. What you are now discussing is something that I think that you should talk over with your parents. You should discuss it with your minister, with your rabbi. But that's not something that I should deal with.
What you just did equally dealt with religious beliefs.
the opt-out, though. I'd like to make a point about the opt-out. I think that that's generally probably what happens to the extent that it's feasible for a teacher, given the curriculum guides that teachers have to comply with. If there's a discrete unit, for example, human evolution that's treated in a high school biology class, that teachers will often make allowances and they'll let the students do some other alternative assignment and not have to attend classes on those days. But I think that this makes an assumption, which science teachers will tell you is it's an invalid assumption. That is that evolution is this discrete area of science that can be carved out of a science class. That's just not the case. A science teacher will tell you, wait a minute, if I can't teach evolution, what am I teaching on day one? How do I connect all the dots in the science class? I'm left just with a bunch of disconnected facts. I have no narrative to give my students to put all these facts together.
Well, if the opt-out becomes that extensive, if the opt-out request becomes that extensive, then it can't be complied with. It has to be discrete. Right. But, and parents understand that. But
May I jump in here?
The other thing is, I just want to say, Wendell, first, is that kids have a constitutional right to express their views. And sure, they can't take over the classroom or offer long sermons, but I certainly would advise teachers to allow kids to express their views, religious or otherwise, when the topic comes up.
Mr. Byrd?
That earlier comment about what a teacher might say is far more insidious and harmful and dishonest than telling the student, I believe your religious view is simply false and stupid. The reason is when you marginalize their sincerely held religious belief or philosophical conclusion, to say, we're talking about science here, that's not science, it doesn't belong here, you're welcome to believe it, you're welcome to believe crazy things. You have essentially told them that what they believe is not a legitimate idea, it is not true, it contradicts science, science is true, and if crazy people wish to hold crazy ideas, they're welcome to do it, but it won't make it science.
Well,
and what you have done is locked the science classroom door to any scientific evidence and any scientific belief except the one that is officially approved that's allowed to come through the door.
I think that Mr. Byrd is doing his own constituency a disservice. What I mean to say here is that it is not the role of a science teacher to tell any of his students that science proves that there is no God. I think that you are treading on a very thin ice.
Let's try and wrap it up if we can by seeing if there is any common ground here. I suspect, again, people are listening to this and watching this and saying, well, is there something we can do here that accommodates everybody's beliefs, everybody's rights, everybody's interests? Dr. Haynes, is there something realistically that's out there that we can aspire to?
I think there's a lot of common ground. You might not be able to tell it today, but there is. That is to say, I think if people on various sides, and there are scientists in all camps here, if they could begin to help public education learn what the guidelines should be in order to open the science classroom up to a rich discussion, including controversy, history of science, where science came from, the limits of science. We're asking teachers right now to do something they don't understand how to do. We're not preparing them. I think people on all sides could open the science classroom up by getting these together and getting some better guidelines that would protect the conscience of all people and the integrity of teaching science, but would let critiques in and controversy and let the voices be heard at some point. Doesn't have to take over, doesn't have to have equal time, but I think people on frankly, the creationist perspectives, and there are a number of them, they're not one of them, I think they would support at least letting critiques be heard.
Yeah. Briefly, Mr. Byrd, before we lose you, your thoughts on some common ground?
I think the best way to go for common ground is to agree that all of the scientific evidence on the subject ought to be taught. When there is scientific evidence, as Ropp writes, Stanley writes, unfortunately the origins of most higher categories are shrouded in mystery. Commonly new higher categories appear abruptly in the fossil record without evidence of transitional ancestral forms. The honest thing is to present that evidence along with what's taught in traditional evolutionary class. The dishonest thing is to censor that evidence, leave it out, and then tell the students you're not allowed to hear the evidence that we're not even going to acknowledge is out there. You just go to your church and believe whatever crazy things you want to believe.
Dr. Dembski?
There are a lot of open questions. The theory claims to account for everything, and that's how it's presented in high school classes. And then when people have their religious sensibilities wiped out and then get to grad school, they find out that there really wasn't a whole lot there. So to have a critique where we can even say, you know, maybe we don't even know what happened. Maybe we don't even know what happened in terms of how these complex biochemical systems came about. Why is ignorance such a bad thing instead of forcing a theory to be in place? But okay, so if we can have a critique, which then maybe just clears the field. We used to think that phrenology accounted for all of human psychology. It got wiped out. And then, do we have any positive alternatives? I don't think that creation science and the way it's been taught with a 6,000-year chronology, reading Genesis as a literal scientific text works. But I think that there are some other approaches which are being developed now.
Dr. Patey,
and I think that phrenology got wiped out because it was tested and found not to be adequate on a scientific basis, and I think that's a really important point to make. Rather than marginalize religion, though, I think that what the discussion that Mr. McElrath and I have been putting through and what I've seen in documents of state curricula in science has been this same kind of religious sensitivity that we're all talking about, but that simply we actually marginalize science. We say science doesn't explain everything. We say that we work on the secondary laws, the mechanisms for what happens in nature. We don't go beyond that. There is, as we will all acknowledge, a version of scientism that does assert that there is nothing in the universe except what we could see. But that is not what science operates on. Science operates on what we can only see to test. If personal views of certain scientists, or indeed anyone who's not a scientist, you can be an atheist and a literature professor and be a scientist in that broad, a scientism type person in that narrow category. I mean, I think we would all agree. We have to separate these things and get them out of the way so we can really work on where the science is.
Point of clarification, we try to understand the world, the physical world, but the entities we use to understand and explain can be things which are unobservable.
That's right.
But Mr. McElrath, your last word here on prospects for common ground.
Well, I think that there is common ground, and it's a neutral science classroom. And to the extent that we can work hard to keep a science classroom religion-free and indoctrination-free, then we're serving everybody. I think not the interests of science and the interests of religion, neither one benefits from opening the door to religion in the science classroom. And you have to remember this, we're talking about a very narrow area here. It's the public school science classroom. There are parochial schools. There are social classes in the public schools. There are churches. There are a variety of fora in which people can learn these concepts if they want to learn them.
We'll have to leave the issue there for today. Perhaps it's difficult to find common ground when the theories of the creation of the earth are so incompatible. However, the basic issue here is how are children to be taught about evolution and divine creation, and in what classes? Because of the strong feelings on this issue on both sides, it's apparent that this debate will continue in town halls and at school board meetings around the country. I'd like to thank my guests and thank you also for joining us Inside the Law.
Inside the Law is made possible in part by a grant from Reliance National Insurance Company, providing property, casualty, accident, and health insurance. Reliance National, the choice. And is produced in association with the American Bar Association.